They say the past never truly stays buried. Sometimes it sits in old boxes, hidden behind locked doors, or whispered only at night when no one else is listening. But other times it leaks out like a slow poison, staining everything it touches. Tonight, what you're about to hear is not fiction, not rumor. It is the unsettling truth of a son who sold his own father to strangers online. Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. This story begins, not in the chaos of the modern web, but in the silence of a family home, one that looked ordinary to anyone passing by. The neighbors swore the father was a quiet, good man. He worked with his hands, building and fixing, and in his younger days, he had been respected. But behind closed doors, the relationship between father and son was nothing like the calm picture they presented. It was tense, fractured, and rotting. The son was restless, bitter, and obsessed with the digital shadows that most of us try to avoid. He prowled late at night on hidden forums, lost in conversations with faceless strangers who promised him things he didn't dare ask for in daylight. His father, aging and tired, became more of a burden in his eyes than a figure of respect. Historians often uncover old letters, diaries, or dusty photographs that show cracks in families long before disaster strikes. But here, the diary was digital. Each post, each message, left traces of a mind spiraling into something darker. The son was not asking strangers for companionship or money. He was offering something in return, something unthinkable, his own father. To the curious, it might seem impossible. How could someone treat blood like currency? Yet, history is full of betrayals. Sons who sold kingdoms, daughters who poisoned mothers, families that destroyed themselves from within. The son's first step was subtle, almost innocent to the untrained eye. A single post buried deep in the labyrinth of hidden forums. His words were cautious, coded, but unmistakable to those who lurked long enough in those dark corridors. I have something you might want, something living, something close. Most readers dismissed it as nonsense, but there are always those who do not laugh. Strangers who wait patiently for messages just like this. And soon, replies began to trickle in. Careful at first, then bolder, hungrier. What he offered was not an item, not an object, but his father. Not as a joke, not as a metaphor, but as if the man's flesh, dignity, and very existence were something to be traded away. History tells us that markets for the forbidden have always thrived. Slavery, betrayal, secrets. This, perhaps, was simply the modern face of an ancient crime. The son described his father not with love, not even with hate, but with a strange detachment. He spoke of his age, his body, his habits, as if cataloging an animal. His words stripped the man of humanity, reducing him to a mere description for strangers to evaluate. And the strangers responded, offering ideas, suggestions, even payment, as though this were no more than a twisted negotiation. One cannot help but wonder, was the father aware? Did he sense the eyes of strangers on him, though he never left his home? Neighbors would later say they noticed nothing unusual, nothing at all. And that is often the way of such stories. The horror builds silently, invisible, until it is too late. The historian in me sees in this story the reflection of older tragedies. Families who betrayed one another during wars, siblings who turned each other over to kings and soldiers. But here there was no battlefield, no crown at stake. Only a son who looked at his father and saw profit in the shadows of the web. This was... As the son's words spread quietly through the underbelly of the web, replies turned into conversations, and conversations into something more sinister. The strangers were no longer anonymous shadows. They became participants, co-authors of the plan. Each one had their own hunger, their own reason for entertaining such an offer. Some were driven by cruelty, others by curiosity, and some by that unexplainable fascination with destroying what was once whole. The son found himself emboldened. Each response made him feel less alone, less insane. He had discovered a community willing to listen, willing to encourage him, even reward him. And with every keystroke, He sank deeper into their world. He began describing his father in ways that made the old man sound less like a person and more like merchandise. His age, his scars, the roughness of his hands, the weary slope of his shoulders, all reduced to details in a grotesque advertisement. History has always been filled with transactions that dehumanize. Bodies sold in markets, voices silenced for coins, betrayals exchanged for survival. Yet here, there was no war, no famine forcing his hand. There was only choice, an act born from within. That is what makes it so deeply unsettling. Meanwhile, the father lived unaware of the words typed about him in the dark. He still rose early, fixed small things around the house, and ate meals in silence. To the neighbors, nothing had changed. But beneath the ordinary surface, his fate was being debated by faceless men scattered across the globe. His life, his very existence, was reduced to a question. How much? There are reports, fragments of logs, screenshots that historians of the digital age have since recovered. They read like transcripts of an ancient inquisition, but colder. Lines of text stripped of emotion, strangers bargaining as though human life were no more than a piece of few. The deeper the son went into the shadows of the internet, the more the strangers began to shape his thoughts. At first, they asked questions, simple, almost playful. What does he look like when he sleeps? Does he ever leave the house? But soon, the tone shifted. The questions became commands. They asked for photographs, proof of life, glimpses into the private existence of a man who had no idea he was being traded away like property. The son complied. He began to watch his father through a new lens, not as a man who raised him, but as inventory. Late at night, when the father drifted into restless dreams, the son would creep into the room and snap grainy photos, capturing his bent posture, his lined face, the fragile way he clutched at his blanket. These images were sent to strangers, who devoured them like relics of a forbidden ritual. In history, we read of betrayals that unfolded in silence. Sons who drew maps of their fathers' estates for rival kings, daughters who whispered secrets of their families to enemies in exchange for gold. The son's actions were not new, only the medium had changed. What had once been parchment and ink was now pixels and code. But the treachery, the breaking of blood, was timeless. The strangers began to speak of the father as though he already belonged to them. They argued over who would claim him, who would decide his fate, who would hold the son accountable if he failed to deliver. The son, once hesitant, began to feel trapped in their promises. It was no longer just an idea. It was a contract carved in whispers, binding him to strangers who thrived on his weakness. The father noticed small changes but could not name them. He saw the way his son stared too long, the way silence filled the rooms like a heavy fog. He muttered once, almost to himself, "You look at me as though I'm already gone." The son said nothing, and perhaps that the son's messages had gone from hesitant questions to bold declarations. By now, the strangers were no longer faceless names on a screen. They had become voices inside his head, whispering instructions, urging him to complete what he had begun. Each night he returned to their conversations, and each night he sank further into their grip. The father noticed the change but could not explain it. His son, once restless but still grounded in reality, now walked with a strange detachment. He lingered too long in empty rooms, his eyes darting as though watching someone who wasn't there. At meals, he ate in silence, his fork pausing mid-air as if listening to words only he could hear. One evening, the father asked, "Who do you talk to so late at night?" The son's reply was simple, almost rehearsed. "Friends." But the word felt wrong in his mouth, like a mask that barely covered the truth. Historians often speak of moments when families collapsed not in sudden explosions, but in small fractures, tiny betrayals that grew until nothing could hold them together. This was such a moment. The son began to treat his father less like kin and more like a task to be completed. He measured his father's routines, charted his movements, and sent updates to strangers who read them with fascination. It was as though the father's life had become a ledger, every detail written down, priced, and passed around for invisible eyes to examine. The son's loyalty had shifted. His true bond was no longer to his father, but to the dark crowd that fed him approval and attention. In the shadows of the house, the father began to feel the weight of something unsaid. He couldn't place it, but he felt watched. Even in solitude, even in silence, he sensed an audience. It was the same sensation described by men centuries ago, who claimed they were haunted not by ghosts, but by the living gaze of those who. By this point, the strangers no longer asked. They demanded. They wanted proof that the son was serious, that he was not simply feeding them a fantasy. And the son, desperate to keep their approval, desperate to remain part of their twisted fellowship, gave them what they sought. Late one night, when the house was still, and the only sound was the ticking of an old clock, the son crept into his father's room. He carried with him not love, not care, but a camera. The dim light from the hallway caught his father's face, creased by years, softened by sleep. To most, it would have been a portrait of vulnerability. To the strangers, it was evidence. He clicked the shutter, and in that instant his father became not a man, but merchandise displayed before an unseen crowd. The photograph was sent, and the responses came swiftly. Some praised him, others pushed harder. When do we see more? When does he belong to us? The son's world shrank until their voices were all that mattered. His father's quiet breathing in the next room became background noise to the roar of strangers who demanded his obedience. History is littered with such moments. Children who betrayed their families to invaders, who opened gates during sieges, who pointed trembling fingers toward their kin in exchange for safety or power. But here, there were no armies, no torches, only the glow of a computer screen, casting the son's face in pale light as he sold away what should never be sold. The father, though unaware of the full truth, began to feel it pressing on him. He woke one night to find his son standing in the doorway, unmoving, as if carved from shadow. The old man whispered his son's name but received no reply. It was a look he would never forget, the gaze of someone who was no longer fully his. What followed in the digital threads is difficult to read. The strangers began to assign roles, as if the night of reckoning came quietly, without thunder or warning. The son had promised too much to turn back. The strangers, faceless and relentless, waited for proof of his final betrayal. And in his silence, he delivered. The father was unaware of the invisible audience peering into his life. He sat in his worn chair, dozing lightly, unaware that his son had placed him on a stage. A camera was set, the frame chosen, and with one click, the father's dignity was sold. His image was passed through hidden forums, judged, claimed, consumed. He was no longer just a man. He was property, offered to those who should never have had such power. The son believed he had found belonging, but what he found was a prison. For once you give away your blood, you can never take it back. The strangers did not leave him in peace. They pressed for more, demanded his obedience, demanded his silence. He had become their puppet, and his father their trophy. In old chronicles, historians describe families undone not by outsiders, but by their own children. A son who betrayed his father to Roman soldiers. A daughter who revealed her mother's hiding place to a king's men. Those stories are centuries old, yet here, in this quiet house, the same wound opened again. It is proof that history never truly dies. It only changes costume. The father sensed the betrayal too late. He noticed the absence of warmth in his son's eyes, the strange way neighbors whispered, the silence that pressed against the walls of his home. Perhaps he never understood the depth of what had been done to him. Perhaps it was mercy that he didn't. And so the story ends not with blood spilled, not with dramatic revelation, but with something colder, erasure. A man reduced to an object, a father turned into a commodity, and a son bound forever to his act of betrayal. The house stood silent. The neighbors carried on, but the TIE